All right. Well, as we begin a new book tonight, let's pray and ask the Lord to be favorable for us. So, Lord, thank you for this time. Thank you for this beautiful day today, this precursor to the fall. We pray for you to give us insight into your word, into this new book, into this book of Moses, and let us learn from its history, from its laws, from its precepts, and for its applications to our life. So we thank you for these things and pray for your leadership in these things in Christ's name. Amen. All right. So, the book of Deuteronomy. We will cover the first half of chapter 1 tonight. Now, let me give you some pre-understandings as we go into this book. I want to tell you about a few things about it. Obviously, this is the last book of the Torah. Mm-hmm. The Torah, of course, is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The rest of the whole Bible, according to the Hebrew, is called the Tanakh. So the Torah is contained in the Tanakh. All of it is called the Tanakh, okay? But only the first 5 books are called the Torah. Now, let's mention the context of the Torah. You have Genesis, which of course we could very much call the book of the beginnings, because the first things occur in so many areas in the book of Genesis. Then of course you have Exodus, which is the birth of the nation and its basic organization. Then of course we have Leviticus. Leviticus are both the laws and the ceremonial and sacrificial worship system that was set up by God in the Old Testament. Then we have Numbers. And if you haven't read Numbers, it's really quite an interesting book because it's really all about the wilderness wanderings. And it tells you all the stories of what happened during the wilderness wanderings. And then comes Deuteronomy, which is both a history and a discussion of the law revisited. Now, some people call Deuteronomy the mini Torah because it has so many other elements in the other books of the Torah in it. Now, one of the things I think it's interesting when you read commentaries, and particularly liberal commentaries on Deuteronomy, is they have things like what's called the Jdp Theory, which is their crazy explanation for who wrote the Torah. It's really not that hard to figure out who wrote the Torah. You don't have to read that many verses before you hear the Lord saying to Moses, write this down in a book. Mm-hmm. And it's reiterated if you read over and over again. So, who do you think wrote the Torah? The person that the Lord said wrote the Torah, and he dictated it to. Okay, he dictated it to Moses. So that's what the authorship is. Now, a couple of things I think are interesting about Deuteronomy. It's the most quoted book of the Torah by Jesus. Of all the prophets that Jesus quotes in the New Testament, in the Gospels, Deuteronomy is the number one number of quotes that he cites. So that makes some very interesting things for us. It proves to us that Jesus authenticated the authorship of the Torah, Moses, and he authenticated also the Torah as authoritative scripture. Otherwise, why would he cite from it word for word? So Jesus authenticates the book of Deuteronomy in doing that. And of course, he ascribes it clearly to Moses. Now, what we see, that we're going to study in Deuteronomy, is both the history of the movement and activities and events battles even, of the Jews, okay, and a review of the law. Now, why is there a review of history and a review of the law? Do you know why?
Different generation.
Yes. How? Say it.
Well, it's the second generation. The first one were all
Exactly.
People produced, he got miracles, during the Exodus.
Exactly. This is the generation after the generation in the wilderness died out. This is the generation that comes after them. So Moses has got to kind of get them up to snuff in terms of laws, history, what's happened, etc. Very good, Jack. So that's exactly why we have this in it. Now, the Septuagint, which of course is the Greek version of the Old Testament, calls this book Deuteronomion. Okay? That's how we get Deuteronomy in the English. And deutera, second, monium, law or code, means, of course, second law. But interestingly, that's not what the Jews call this book. They call this book Elah Hadim Barim. Elah Hadim Barim, which means these are the words. Okay? Why do they call it that? Because if you turn to Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1, it says, these are the words which Moses spoke to all of Israel. So they call it based on the first few words that introduces Deuteronomy 1:1. That's their name for the book.
Now, what's the language here? Original?
Hebrew.
Hebrew.
Yeah. So in Hebrew, it's Elah Hadem Barim. Okay? Now, notice in verse 1, Israel is in the southeast area of this land, but they are supposed to occupy it by moving to the north and moving through several countries in the process. So they are right here. Okay? This is Jubal al-Laz. That's Mount Sinai, or also called Horeb. The Bible calls it Sinai or Horeb interchangeably, okay? This is the mountain where they were at, okay? And of course, we're going to go through what the history is. But ultimately, when they leave, okay, they move north. They move to the east side of the Red Sea. They move into the area of the Amalekites and the Kenites, and move up into the area of Edomites. They then move further up eventually into Moab itself, and they go all the way up to this area we call Bashan, which today you would call the Golan Heights in Israel, okay? Up in this area, northeast of the Sea of Galilee is the Golan Heights. Then they retrace their steps down, okay? And they end up finally crossing over here eventually at the Jordan River, and of course begin their occupation of the land. So I wanted you to get an idea of kind of where the places are and what the map looks like. Now, they spent, and you can't see it all in this map, but they spent 40 years wandering down here. Okay, down here is Saudi Arabia. Okay, below to the south and to the east of the Red Sea area, the Gulf of Aqaba, and they literally spent 40 years roaming around as God led them all around Saudi Arabia. Isn't it ironic that the Jews spent 40 years in Saudi Arabia? I don't think the Saudis would appreciate that very much, but that's the truth. And we can prove that it's the truth, and I'm going to show you proof that it's true. It cannot...
Someone calculated that it would only take them like a few days to actually cross, a couple of weeks.
To go from Horeb down there up into this area where we're going to talk about they go, which is right, let's see, going to be right let's see, where is it on the map? Yeah, Kadesh Barnea here, okay? For them to go from here to here takes 11 days, walk. So that's the old, it's 125 miles or so is basically what it is. So, yeah, not that far distance. Yes?
Tim, how many generations is it from Adam and Eve to this period of time, approximately?
I can tell you in years, but I can't.
Gotta find a time frame.
Well, the garden, no one knows exactly when it occurred. I think most people would put it probably somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 BC. We know the time of Abraham more clearly. That's going to be around 2100 BC. Okay? Then you have almost 500 years. During that time, you have the movement into Egypt of the Jews, the growth of the nation there in Egypt, the enslavement of the people there, because they're there, remember, they're there over 400 years.
Right.
Okay? And then, of course, then comes the time of the Exodus. That's going to be about 1500 BC. So this is maybe 1450 BC, about this time where it's ready to go back and try it over again. Does that help you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Now, I want to mention a few things about Moses, because you can't read Deuteronomy or any of the Torah without being impressed of the person of Moses. He's a central figure. So let me tell you a few things that are important to realize about him. Obviously, we know he's most famous for leading the Jews out of Egyptian slavery. That is pretty obvious. Even not a very good Bible student will probably figure that one out. Number two is that he becomes, of course, the human mediator of the covenant law. Okay? There at Horeb, down there, Moses goes up to the mountain, comes down from the mountain, goes up to the mountain, comes down from the mountain. And he's the mediator between God, who's literally putting his presence on the top of the mountain, and the people who are down at the bottom of the mountain. And I'm going to show you some features, because I've got photographs to show you tonight. They were prohibited from touching the sides of the mountain. They were kept a distance away because the holy God was on top. And if they did touch it, or an animal touched it, they died. So God was physically putting his presence on the top of this mountain. I'm going to show you evidence that shows you that that's exactly what he did in just a minute, all right? So going on about Moses, he is called the first prophet. Now, actually, he's the first prophet of the nation of Israel. Abraham was called a prophet, but the Jews weren't a nation. So Moses is the first prophet of the nation of Israel. Okay? Fourthly, he is most mentioned. He's the most prophet who's most mentioned in the New Testament of all the prophets. Moses is the most mentioned. Fifthly, he has a very unique death. God takes him. Okay, God takes him to the top of Mount Nebo. It overlooks to the east well, he looks actually to the west, into the what would be the promised land where they're going to go. He can't go there because of his disobedience that's noted. He says, I want you to see it, but you can't go there. And then it says he dies, even though it describes that he was 120 years old and he was vigorous and his eyesight was great. As you go, this is not a guy who looks like he's going to die. He looks vigorous, healthy, and God says, time's up. And then the most extraordinary thing of all is who buries him. God. God buries him. Now you go, well, why does God bury him? Well, let me give you at least one opinion, more than opinion, but reason why God buried him. I'm going to read Jude 9 to you, okay? But Michael, the archangel, when he disputed, or the word means contended, with the devil over the body of Moses, did not dare pronounce against him railing judgment, but he said that the Lord God rebuke you. So you go, so why did Michael dispute with Satan over the body of Moses?
Satan wanted his body.
Right. Obviously, there's a reason why Satan wanted Moses' body, but he obviously didn't get it. Yeah, exactly. He didn't get it because two other things have to happen to Moses, and that's why God wouldn't allow Satan to get a hold of it. The first one is mentioned in Matthew 17, the Transfiguration. Who shows up on top of the mountain? 3 people. Jesus goes up, and 2 other people are up there. Moses and Elijah. So Moses' body has to be around so that God can use it to put him on top. Remember, Elijah was taken up into heaven, didn't die natural death, right? And Moses had this weird death, and God confiscates his body. Now, the next thing, of course, is the future of Moses, which is also unique. I think it was mentioned. And that is that we see that in Revelation 11, there are these 2 witnesses that are in the first 3.5 years of the tribulation period. And these guys, who I think are clearly described as Moses and Elijah in the text there in Revelation 11, they spend 3.5 years making the life of Antichrist completely miserable. Okay? Whatever he tries to accomplish in certain areas, they don't let him. Okay? They can bring fire down from heaven. They can stop rain. They can do all this stuff miraculously, you know. And of course, finally, at the 3.5 year period, God allows them to be killed. But then he goes ahead and resurrects them again. Yeah. Okay? And of course, then the last 3.5 years of the tribulation period go on. So,
would the people have worshipped him, his body?
Maybe.
Had they found it?
They certainly found all kinds of things to worship that they weren't supposed to.
Yeah. Right.
They did a good job with the bronze serpent, you know, and worshipped it for generations until God had to destroy it because of that. So, we're going to talk here about Jabal el-Laz, or called Mount Horeb, or called Mount Sinai. Now, first thing to realize about it, okay, is that this down here and a little bit further south of here is called the Negev. It's the southern part of Israel that borders on Egypt. Okay, the Negev, the south, is literally what it means. And the historical belief has been ever since about 330 AD by Constantine's mother, named Helena, that was the site down there of Mount Sinai. Okay? Except if you look, and archaeologists have for a long, long time, there isn't any evidence whatsoever that Mount Sinai is there. But there's a lot of evidence, I'm going to show you in a minute, that Mount Sinai is right there. Okay? And of course, that is northwest Saudi Arabia. Now, why do we say we know that Mount Horeb is not in the Sinai Peninsula? Well, number one, we can turn, if you want to, turn to Galatians 4. Galatians 4. This seems to have escaped the notice of an awful lot of people, which amazes me. Verse 25, he's using this allegory to teach a truth. It's about these two women, the free woman and the bond woman.
Yeah.
Okay? Look what verse 25 says. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is slavery with her children. So what's clearly being said here by Paul? Mount Sinai is in Saudi Arabia. So why people looked anyplace else, I don't know, because it's very clear what Paul says right there. So that's one extremely good argument. Now there's a second argument, and it's an argument of evidence. And I want to go to some pictures and go through some things and show you the evidence we have. If you can turn that.
The next one?
Yeah, go to the next one. All right, now, this is Rephidim. This is a picture, literally of Rephidim, that was taken less than a year ago. It was taken October 14th of 2019. Why? Because my friend, Bill, was one of the first people to be allowed to go into Saudi Arabia, and he took that picture. Yeah.
They actually were the first Americans who were allowed.
This is the book that Bill made of his trip, and he gave to me last Christmas. And it's interesting, fascinating photography. I took some of the pictures out of it to show you, but that was less than a year ago. So you can see what Rephidim looked like. Is it not, it says, and Moses split the rock. Is that not fairly obvious to you that rock is split? So, again, there's evidence. Now, Rephidim is not exactly Sinai, but now here's another one. This is not necessarily in order. But in 1 Kings 19, it says that Elijah, after he killed the prophets of Baal, Jezebel got a little angry with him, a tad, and decided that she was going to lay hands on him and kill him. And so he fled.
I'm sorry, I'm going to move this here, because they cannot see what's our song. There we go.
Okay, he fled, and he fled to this cave.
Is it better, guys?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, this cave is on a part of Mount Sinai, up about now maybe 3/4 or 4/5 of the way up. Sinai is over 8,000 feet tall. Oh yeah, it's 8,600 feet tall, I think, to the very top. So here's the cave where Elijah went to, and we have evidence of it right there. So go to the next thing and see what we got here. Okay, now, it says in the, I think in the 24th chapter of Exodus, I didn't pull the references, but it says that these foundation stones were put in for these pillars, these markers that went around the side of Sinai. Remember I told you, because no animals or people could go up and touch the side of the mountain. Here's the base of them.
It's amazing.
Okay?
Still there.
3,500 years later, they're still there.
The base of what?
Pillars.
Of Sinai.
Oh.
These are part of the pillars that were spread around. Okay? There's just a few of them there. Now, here's an interesting one. It says that God promised that wherever their feet tread, that God would give them that property. Look what they did.
Yeah.
They inscribed the outside of their feet on the rocks. 3,500 years old. Northwest Saudi Arabia. Keep going. All right. Here's some more of the foundation pillars you see here. Okay. Here's just a picture of them going up. Here's looking at a picture of the top up here of Sinai, of Horeb. Keep going, because I want to. All right, there's a beautiful picture of Rephidim. Does that not show the split well?
And the smoothness of the rocks.
Oh, yeah. Now remember, out of that came down here a pool of water that was able to quench the thirst of 2 million people. It was a reservoir that came out of that thing. A huge amount. As a matter of fact, they've been there, obviously, archaeologists have been there, and they look at the sediment there, and they conclude this is a dry lake bed. I mean, it shows all the evidence of being a dry lake bed. Okay, keep going. I want to get to a picture of the top here. Okay, go back one. Okay, there. Notice, this is a picture of Sinai. It's light colored until you get to the very top. This whole thing is granite. The top is black. They've gone up to it, picked up rocks from it, burnt, yes, they've broken them open and the surface is burnt, but the inside's not. So the only heat source had to have been from external. It says God was on the mountain in fire and in smoke. He burnt the whole top of it by being there. All right? Go ahead. There's several other features that are shown here. One is that there's an altar area, although this doesn't show maybe that is the big altar. If you read the text in Exodus, there was a large altar that was set up. And it was for obviously the sacrifice of the animals, the cattle and the goats, etc. And so there also were these rock channels they built that they would run the animals down. I think if you keep going, we might see them here. Now this is, okay, let me go back one. Sorry. Go back one. Now, what you just saw next is inscribed on the side of this. And we're going to see other inscriptions, and they're all huge inscriptions, almost like petroglyphs, of cattle, of bulls. All right? What is it that they did when Moses was up? They made the golden calf because that's a god in Egypt. So they made out of gold a god of Egypt, and they inscribed that on the rock there. 3,500 years old. You can see other examples. Here's an example of Egyptian art. Here are the cows. Look at the comparison. Okay? Obviously, it's practically identical. All right? Keep going. Now, here's the cave of Elijah here. Here's another point or top, but it's not the exact top. It's part of the mountain crest area, but that's where the cave, you see how close it is to the top. So that thing's up, 7,500 or more feet high. Keep going. Okay, there's one I think that's most of them. Except I thought we had in there the cattle. You can almost see it. Go back one. You can almost see it there. Do you see this line of stones and this other line of stones? We had another picture, but I don't know if we captured that. But at any rate, it's how they take the cattle for the sacrifices. They go down into this area. They would then hold them in a stone enclosure, like a stone corral, and then the altar would be there, and then they'd sacrifice them. Okay, there you go. See, that's the altar. 3,500. I mean, this is the stone corral there.
Question: have they opened that up now so that people can come in?
Well, they've allowed a very, very limited number of people to do it, and Bill was able to go with Joel Richardson. You remember Joel Richardson who wrote the book? You know what I'm talking about? Suzanne, you know who Joel Richardson is? Okay. He's an author. He's a prominent person who writes books and has written about Israel and written about prophetic things, etc. So Joel applied and got a permit to go, the first one ever last year. And the Saudi government approved it. And then somehow it was some kind of lottery kind of thing where he opened up. And Bill, my friend Bill DeBolt.
DeBolt, you know him.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. You know him. You saw him. Jan and Gary.
He comes to the New Year's Eve gathering at Gary and Jan Vaughn's house. Bill DeBolt and Jerry DeBolt. At any rate. So at any rate, Bill got chosen to go. And that's how he got there. So at any rate, that's basically what I wanted to show you.
Is the Saudi government currently now in the process of building a big city there at the base of that mountain?
I don't know.
I do believe they are.
Okay, that may be. You probably have information I don't have.
Oh, it's 500. It's already started.
Really?
33 times the size of New York City, called Neon. It's a city of.
Oh, that's right. I have heard of Neon.
M-E-O-N. I think N-E-O-M.
Yeah.
Neon.
Yeah. It's interesting because originally, when the first people figured this out in the 90s, there was a couple that worked for a large oil company. He did. And during the time when everyone had to be in Mecca for the great pilgrimage, you know, you had to be, essentially, anyone that was not a Muslim was kind of kicked out of the country during that time. And so they went on a trek, and reading their Bibles, they said, I wonder what Jebel el-Lawaz looks like. And so as a family, they took camping equipment and went there and took original pictures and video of all these places. And after they posted them, you saw the fencing. The Saudi government came in and fenced it off. Right.
They didn't want to do it for gold.
No.
That's one of the reasons.
Yeah.
But they're going to turn that place into a tourist destination.
Yeah. And of course they'll...
God's mountain is what they're going to call it.
Right. Now think about it though. What a great, unbelievable testament to Judaism, and what an unbelievable argument against Islam. Okay? So it shows all the evidence of what the Old Testament says is true. So let's go back to Deuteronomy. Now, we see also that during this 40-year wandering, that, and we see it in verse, I'm sorry, maybe I skipped a section here for a sec. So after the 40-year wandering, the Lord tells Moses in verse 3, okay, it's time to go. He commanded them to leave. It's time to go, okay, to take possession. Now, it's interesting that in the Old Testament, God is either called his holy name that the Jews won't even try to pronounce, Yahweh, or he's called Adonai, or he's called El Shaddai, all right, which in English, we translate all of those as Lord. They're very specific terms in Hebrew, but we don't have a specific term for it. Sometimes we use the word Jehovah, but actually, you know where that comes from? It's a German derivation. It's a German name, Jehovah. So not very good. Not very good. Not very good Hebrew. So now notice that in the New Testament, the second person of the Trinity, who in the Old Testament is called the angel of the Lord. Now remember how many times in the past and other areas we've talked about, particularly when we were Joshua, we talked about, and the angel of the Lord shows up, the angel of the Lord shows up, the angel of the Lord leads them, the angel of the Lord took them out of Egypt, the angel of the Lord was a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. You know, we showed all the evidences of the angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord, of course, is the second person of the Trinity. The person in the New Testament that we call Jesus. All right? So, in the New Testament, the angel of the Lord takes human form, as was promised in Isaiah and other places, and he therefore is clearly revealed. Not only is he clearly revealed, but he also clearly reveals his Father. And we see in the New Testament, particularly in the Gospel of John, the constant discussion about the Father and the Son, the Father and the Son, the Father and the Son.
Are one.
Well, are one. They're separate, but they also are one. So we see now that through Christ, the Lord in the Old Testament is personal and knowable, and he's evidenced by this father-son relationship. I want you to turn to John 8. Hold your place in Deuteronomy and go to John 8. There's this discussion that goes on here in chapter 8 that is completely annoying the Pharisees about, Jesus says he's the light of the world in verse 12. He says he bears witness to what the Father says in verse 14. And they go on. And in verse 19 of John 8, it says, And so they were saying to him, "Where is your father?" And Jesus answered, "You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also." Pretty clear, isn't it? I show who my Father is. I took as God human form so I could show you the characteristics of who my Father is, because I represent my Father to you on this earth. And that's the change that occurs. Now, we also see back in Deuteronomy here, we see mention in verse 4 that about the defeat of Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and that lived in the capital of Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who lived in his capital, well, it's actually two capitals, Ashtaroth and Edrei. Now, I'm not going to go into this right now, because I think we're going to wait until the end of the second chapter of Deuteronomy and the beginning of the third to go into it, but I think you'll be fascinated about who Sihon and Og really are. They are two kings of these nations, but they have some rather unique characteristics that you're going to see. A lot of unique characteristics you're going to see. But anyway, he just mentions that they're defeated. They were defeated originally on the way. So we'll look at that when we get there. Now, in verses 6 through 8, of course, the Lord commands to begin the journey to occupy the land. They're supposed to move up here, as we said, going into the area of the Kenites, the Amalekites, through into Edom, and of course part of Edom there, and also in this area we see Mount Paran. Also here, of course, in Edom is this, which is current day Jordan in our map, okay? We see also this famous site, Petra. Petra is in Eden. It's a unique fortress that was carved out of sandstone with these very narrow, tall walls. And it's a memorable place, particularly for in the future, because in go ahead.
Isn't that where they're to hide at the last days?
Very good.
Okay.
Yes. Jesus says in Matthew 24, when you see these events occurring, run to the mountain. Okay? That's what he's talking about, Petra. And it appears about a third of them heed that, and they run there. And they're kept safe and fed and taken care of by the Lord at Petra. Now notice in an interesting place, I think it's the 12th chapter, if I'm not mistaken, I'd have to look, of Revelation, Satan shows up at Petra. Okay? And he decides he's not going to let God save a third of Israel because he wants to destroy Israel completely. So he finds a way to create a flood. Okay? So because the walls are so narrow, I mean, if you had a significant flood, although it's a desert, if you did, I mean, there's no escape really inside the narrow walls and canyons there. But God then opens up the earth immediately and swallows all of the water that Satan has created, and again saves the people there. So it's an important place.
Recently, they did show a flood in that area. People were there visiting, and the flood flashed quickly. And it was rather amazing, kind of scary how quickly it filled. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it would fill real quickly with those steep walls like that. That's very true. So they're going to begin this journey north. They're going to go through Moab and the country of Ammon, the Ammonites, ultimately go up all the way to Bashan, up here to what today we'd call the Golan Heights. And they're also going to cross, of course, the Jordan. They're going to then take care of occupy the Negev down here, the very bottom area in the south of Israel. They're then going to go over to the Mediterranean coast, and they're going to take the cities of the Canaanites, the Philistines, and the Mediterranean coast. And then ultimately, they'll even move, at one point, even to southern Lebanon. and we're going to see in a minute who does that. And it says, quote, as far as the Euphrates. Now, one of the things I want you to note about these things is that they're a progression in stages. In other words, Joshua takes them into the land and conquers the mid area and those cities, and then the southern fortifications, and then finally the northern fortifications. And he takes the central part of that area particularly. You see that King David takes care of the Philistines and finally conquers those 5 big cities of the Philistines on the Mediterranean coast. We then see that Solomon, because of expands Israel literally almost into southern Lebanon. So now we see the completion of that prophecy, that it would go even into Lebanon. But you'll be interested that nowhere in the history do you see that they make it to the Euphrates River. You go, well, if the prophecy says that's going to happen, what happened? Well, I want you to...
God promised it.
That's right. So I want you to turn to Isaiah 11. And we're going to read. We're going to start in verse 11 and read through 16. Now, this is speaking of the millennial age. Jesus has taken his throne in Jerusalem. Okay? Obviously, the last temple has been built. All these things have occurred. He's now ruling on the earth, and it says, starting verse 11, then it will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people who will remain from Assyria and Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, which is Persia, Shinar, of course, which is Iraq, Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. And he will lift up a standard for the nations and will assemble the banished ones of Israel. And he'll gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Then the jealousy of Ephraim will depart, and those who harass Judah will be cut off. Ephraim will not be jealous of Judah, and Judah will not harass Ephraim, two of the larger tribes that at times didn't get along together very well. And they will swoop down on the slopes of the Philistines, that is, on the Med coast, to the west. Together they will plunder the sons of the east. They will possess Edom and Moab and the Ammonites, and will be subject to them. Verse 15, and the Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt, that would be the Red Sea area, and he will wave his hand over the river. What's that?
Euphrates.
The Euphrates is reported repeatedly in Scripture called the river, because it was one of the most famous rivers in the Middle East. And he'll wave his hand over the river with his scorching wind, and he will strike it into 7 streams, and he'll make men walk over it dry-shod, and there will be a highway from Assyria, from the remnant of his people who will be left, just as there was for Israel in the day that they came up out of the land of Egypt. So, eventually, but during the millennial kingdom, they will also be in possession of the area of the Euphrates too. But that's still to come. Now,
In this passage, doesn't he call Ephraim Israel, the split off part of Israel?
Ephraim is used for a variety of purposes and meanings depending on what the context is. Sometimes it talks about the tribe of Ephraim. Sometimes it talks about the largest tribe area. Sometimes it's used to almost engulf the whole idea of the concept of Israel because it's the most numerous tribe. So it's used for different, depending on the context, used differently.
But it talks about Ephraim here and Judah.
Yeah.
Israel, you know.
That's the central and south central areas of...
Yeah, but that's the split tribes.
Yes, true. Now, notice, as we go back to Deuteronomy, and we're looking in verses 6 through 8 now, that he says, He says, verse 8, I have placed the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to give to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and to their descendants after them. The reason why they were going into the land is because God called out Abram from Iraq, from Ur, brought him into the Levant, Palestine, if you want to call it, I hate to call it Palestine, but I'd rather call it the Levant, that whole area, okay, and made him a promise in Genesis 12, right? He says, you're going to have a land, you're going to have a people, they're going to be numerous, and I make this promise to you. He reiterates that covenant in Genesis 15. He reiterates that covenant in Genesis 17. He reiterates that covenant at the end of the story about sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22. Then you go to the birth of Isaac, the life of Isaac. God meets Isaac. He reiterates the covenant to Isaac. Then Isaac has these two sons, Jacob and Esau. He then eventually in Jacob's life, he reiterates the promise to Jacob. Okay? He wants them to know that the covenant that he set up will always occur, that the covenant land is not in dispute. And even though God at times judges the Jews, and at 2 points even exiles them, that is the Assyrian exile and the exile to Babylon, never is the covenant renounced. They still technically have a right and a promise to that land. Okay? Now, interestingly, in 70 AD, the Romans come in, or 66 they come in, and by 70 AD they've conquered Jerusalem, they've put down the rebellion in Megiddo, and they exile all the Jews, almost all of them, out of Israel. And from 70 AD to 1948, the Jews are basically not in the land. But it's still the covenant land. Therefore, in 1948, and the times just before it, miraculous events occur, right? In which finally the UN sent in 1947, I think it was November 47, yeah, it was. There was a UN resolution that puts Israel back in its own land again. Why did they do it? Because God said they were going to be back in their own land because it was promised to them. All right? Now, there is an apostrophe or a pause between approximately 70 AD and 1948. And that pause is called, a little bit more than beyond 1948 now, but in that general almost 2,000 year span, that pause is called the church age. Okay? Now, okay. The question, they just need to turn their sound down. Okay. All right. If you would, Norma, if you'd mute your sound, we'd appreciate it.
Well, that's your stomach.
Okay. Now, notice that the land will continue to be theirs, even to the time of Messiah, when he reigns in the land and even expands it to its original promised boundaries, as we just went over. Now, the church age did not end the promise of the Jews to the land. And we have what I can only call, in my opinion, a heresy called replacement theology that says the church takes over for Israel, and all the promises that occurred that God gave to Israel then are somehow transferred to the church. And anyone that believes that crap has never read the 9th, 10th, and 11th chapters of the book of Romans. Because if you read Romans 9, 10, 11, you cannot possibly come up with the idea that the church has supplanted Israel. Okay? A branch is grafted in to the original olive tree. That branch is called the church. The olive tree is Israel. and they will be merged together into one tree by the grafting in, and God will continue to work through Israel all the way through. Now, let's look at verses 9 through 18. Let me read them. 9 through 18 of Deuteronomy 1. He says, "And I spoke to you at that time, saying, I'm not able to bear the burden of you alone. The Lord your God has multiplied you, and behold, you are this day as the stars of heaven in a multitude. May the Lord, the God of your fathers, increase you 1,000-fold more than you are, and bless you, just as he has promised you." Verse 12, "How can I alone bear the load and burden of you and your strife? Choose wise and discerning and experienced men from your tribes, and I'll appoint them as heads I'll appoint them as your heads. And you answered me and said, the thing what you have said is good to do. So I took the heads of your tribes, wise and experienced men, and appointed them heads over you, leaders of thousands and of hundreds and of fifties and of tens, and officers of your tribes. Then I charged you, your judges at that time, saying, hear the cases between your fellow countrymen, and judge righteously between a man and his fellow countrymen, or the alien who is within him. Verse 17, for you shall not show partiality in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. You shall not fear man, for the judgment is God's. And the case that is too hard for you, you shall bring to me, and I will hear it. And I commanded you at that time all the things that you should do. So, here we see that they have multiplied from a family of 70 that entered Egypt. They grew in size in Egypt for that 400 years, okay, under Joseph. Of course, they end up in slavery eventually, but they come out, and it's estimated, I think conservatively, that they were 2 million as they left Egypt. So they've gone from 70 people to 2 million people, all right? So indeed, the promise of Abraham that they'd be like the sands of the sea and like the stars of the sky has come true to that point. Moses insists in this passage that he can't possibly organize, answer law questions, legislate, and over 2 million people. It's obviously an absolute possibility. And all their strife, which of course they had plenty of, we know. So we see here that he states because of the size of the nation that it makes it completely unmanageable by him alone. And we notice that back in Exodus 18, okay, that they were faced with a similar problem, and a similar thing was done. They started to appoint judges and leaders, etc., etc. Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, recommended this to Moses. And of course, that's what they did to try to make it more manageable and make the administration better. Now, so he appoints leaders of the tribes. He appoints court officials, magistrates. He appoints military commanders, all kinds of people he appoints, all these officials. Now notice, I want you to notice about what is justice as is described in this passage, okay? Justice was to be administered fairly, without partiality, both to the Jew and to the foreigner. There was no prejudice of benefit if you were a Jew over foreigner, because God is the God of all people eventually, okay? It was to be fair whether you were rich or poor, whether you were prominent or the little guy. No one is to be specially influenced, to be bought off, to be intimidated by someone's money. Now, notice in that definition what a far cry we have in today's world from this definition of what real justice is. You know, today we have influenced by lobbyists, We have deals between government and private interests. And we just watched, my wife and I, the other night, a very fascinating movie. I think it's a really good one if you want to see a good movie. We didn't know really what it was. It was called The Little Pink House. And it's a true story. It started in 1999, and it's in this area in Connecticut. And what it's about is it deals about the issue of this development corporation that was developed in this area, okay, that coordinated with the city hall of this township, this little town, which also coordinated with the governor's office, which also coordinated with Pfizer Labs. And what happened is that all of these entities decided that this neighborhood and its homes were in the way of Pfizer building a new plant. And so the story is how they go about rather ruthlessly to steal these people's neighborhood. And that's what the story is about. All of this to build a new plant. It really illustrates the collusion that occurs between all these entities and the underhanded things that they do. This is not justice. Today, we see Portland, Oregon. We see Seattle, Washington. We see Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we see evidence of what we call a man-made system that's called the social justice movement. The result of this today's justice movement is the release of rioters back into streets after they've been arrested, hamstringing the police to properly enforce laws on the books, burning down buildings and businesses, minority or not, threatening any official who doesn't agree, attempts to defund the police in these cities. These riots hurt and maim and have now killed people in them, and they kill their opponents at times, and they call this justice. I will suggest to you, and I can show you even specific evidence, that this is not justice, but this is a satanic movement, and that the only basis for real justice is based on God's moral law put into human laws, and that's the only real justice that can ever occur. It's interesting, I just read the other day that the mayor of Portland, who of course has allowed over 90 nights of rioting to go on in Portland, okay? These people are, I'm sorry, excuse me, Lord, stupid enough that they think that they can promote riots and control them. And the good mayor of Portland had a very interesting event that occurred the other night. They tried to burn his condo down. They set the building next to it on fire. They set a business on fire. They tried to set his building on fire. They broke out windows, okay? And of course, instead of having any sense at all, he says, well, I think I'm going to have to move because I don't want you people to be in trouble. That was his statement to the press, okay? Not I'm a moron that lets this go on and I can't control it now, but, you know, for your people's sake, I've got to move. In other words, he's going to go live somewhere else where they don't know where he lives because he knows they can't control it. This is social justice, but it's not God's justice in any way, shape, or form. Now, let's read verses 19 through 25. It says, then we set out from Horeb, that's Sinai, and went through all that great and terrible wilderness which you saw, on the way to the hill country of the Amorites, just as the Lord our God had commanded us, and we came to Kadesh Barnea. And I said to you, you have come to the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord your God is about to give you. Verse 21, see, the Lord your God has placed the land before you. Go up and take possession as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has spoken to you. Don't fear or be dismayed. Now, he's reiterating a history of what has happened. Okay? He's telling this generation that he's sitting in front of now, let me tell you what happened when we started to take the land before, 40 years ago. That's what he's talking about. He says, verse 22, then all of you approached me and said, let us send men before us, that they may search out the land for us and bring back to us the word of the way by which we should go up and the cities that we shall enter. Verse 23, and the thing pleased me, and I took 12 of your men, one man for each tribe. What do we call that? The 12 spies, quote unquote, right? Okay. Verse 24, and they turned and they went up into the hill country and came to the valley of Eshcol and spied it out. Then they took some of the fruit of the land in their hands and brought it down to us, and they brought us back a report and said, it is a good land which the Lord your God is about to give us. All right? Now, Moses, as I said, reiterates the past steps when they originally left Sinai and traveled to the edge of the promised land. And of course, they stopped at Kadesh Barnea. Kadesh of Barnea means Kadesh of the wilderness, or Kadesh of the wandering, is what it means. So they left Horeb, which of course, as we've shown, is in northwest Saudi Arabia. They trekked about 120 miles through the desert. This desert area they went through, by the way, receives 1 inch of rain every decade.
Oh, dear.
That's where they had to trek through. Okay? God provided food for them, manna, at one point quail. He provided water for over 2 million people on a consistent basis. You can't go without 3 days without water. Okay? And they finally traveled through the land of the Amalekites, the Edomites, to a place that, as we said, Kadesh Barnea is very close to Petra today in Jordan. Now, the Lord here urges them to possess these lands that he's told them to take, that's been promised to them. Now, what happens is some people apply to Moses, and they propose to send men to assess the land. Moses agrees and says that's a good idea and appoints men from each tribe. Note one thing, it's really important. God never told him to do that. And the results would prove that it was a mistake. In other words, it proves a point that we should learn in our lives, that good ideas are not equal to God's will. They may be, they may not be, but be careful, because a good idea can turn south fairly quickly. So, these 12 spies are sent, and they see the land has abundant produce. We talk about the grapes of Eshcol, and I want you to turn to the original account of this in Numbers. So go to Numbers 13, and I want you to see what they said. Numbers 13, and we're going to start in verse 23. Then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and from there cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between 2 men with some of the pomegranates and the figs. Can you imagine how big these grapes were? That one bunch of them had to be carried on a pole, carried by 2 people? Okay. God said it would be an abundant land. And indeed, that's what they found. Verse 24, that place was called the Valley of Eshcol, because the cluster which the sons of Israel cut down from there. All right, the Valley of Grapes, literally. Verse 25, when they returned from spying out the land at the end of 40 days, they proceeded to come to Moses and to Aaron and to all the congregation of the sons of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh Barnea, and they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. So they brought all this evidence of the produce with them to show them what's here. Verse 27, thus they told him and said, we went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey. and this is its fruit. Okay? So, they see the evidence that God is going to give them an abundant land if they will simply enter into it. But of course, I didn't read you verse 28. There's a problem. Right, of 10 guys. There's doubt. There's disobedience to the Lord's promise. And what we will look at next week as we finish the second half of Deuteronomy 1 is what happens. And we're going to see what their problem was. What stopped them in their tracks. You'll be interested, I think, if you haven't studied it too much before, what it is that stops them. So, all right? All right. Now, Jack, would you care to close this with prayer?
I'll check my verses and, yeah, I can try.
Okay.
Heavenly Father, thank you for the privilege of being able to study your word and to have Tim give us explanation of the word, which most of us do not know. The background of the nation of Israel is so interesting to us because of the history which is involved in our nations. We ask that you bless our country and that you restore our country to the original Judeo God-fearing principles upon which we were founded. Pray that you give wisdom to our leaders, that they make wise decisions that will be pleasing to you and that will restore our country again. Mm-hmm. We ask that you give us strength and give us wisdom to live at this time and to be able to stand up against the many forces of evil which seem to surround us constantly. Mm-hmm. We ask this in the name of our Lord and Savior, Christ Jesus.
Amen.